Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. We look forward to having you participate in what would be and will be a very important, enlightening discussion on a topic that typically doesn't get the deserved attention it should. We've chosen to start our webinar series after the summer break with a focus on the regional economy and regional economies. We asked the question, a very broad question in the webinar invitation on a pending crisis. Is there a pending crisis? And we asked this question because, as most of you are aware, have heard from others, there is a global slowdown underway. A global slowdown that is expected to be with us in 2023, 2024. And the Middle East and North Africa region is no exception to this slowdown. In fact, projections have already been made, suggesting that we will see a downgrade in the rates of growth across the region. But we will see this while continuing to experience in many parts of the region the implications of high inflation, financial tightening, and the vulnerabilities that many countries around the world, including our own countries, have experienced. And so it's only logical that we ask the question, as we move into the last quarter of 2023 and 2024, what should we expect for our region? To help answer this question, we've assembled the right panel, in my view. A panel that combines individuals many of you know, who bring many years of experience, both from the financial sector, from the government sector, from the financial institutions, from macro policy, from the practice of policy across the world. I'll be inviting all of them to contribute to this discussion, and I'll be taking questions from the audience. In fact, many of you have already sent questions. We've received some 30 questions already in advance of the webinar. We'll try to summarize them. I will not do introductions for each of the panelists. I think most of you know our esteemed guests. I just want to remind people who want to follow us on the Arabic channel to choose the interpretation option on the Zoom app that you might be using. With this, I would like to start off by following the order of the invitation and inviting our dear friend Ali Al-Bayed to give us a sort of a stock taking with a forward-looking picture about where the region is. Why was the outlook for the region downgraded recently? What does this mean for 2023, 2024? What are the risks that the region is going to have to contend with? And when we talk about the region, we no longer can speak about one constellation of countries. We have to keep in mind, obviously, the Gulf versus the Levant versus North Africa. What about the impact of China's slowdown? All of this, we hope Alia will help us think through what it means for the region, how the outlook has changed, and what we should be looking for, and what should policymakers be paying attention to. Alia?
Thank you very much, Tarek, and the Middle East Center for Global Affairs for inviting me to this timely and important discussion. And I want to start about what you said, Tarek, about the fact that the MENA region is indeed, similarly to other emerging markets, being significantly impacted by the confluence of factors that are forming this increasingly challenging macro backdrop. And of course, there are key reasons why the outlook that started in 2023, which is a recovery from a post-COVID lockdown and higher growth, return of flows, at least on the current side, with tourism and trade reinvigorating, is now being dampened by a much more worrying signs into the end of the year and into 2024. And I would like to speak maybe about 5 factors that I believe will shape the outlook for the region and explain how. I think the first factor is obviously the slowdown, both in China, but also the signs, even though they are more dampened, but of a gloomy, basically business environment and economic environment in Europe. But also, despite the resilience in the US, we're starting to see the economy impacted by the 500 plus increase in the Fed fund rate. So the global slowdown will have its own spillovers on China on the one hand for oil exporters and impacting oil demand, even though the nature of the growth in China is changing, and we have seen still quite a robust oil demand, particularly for diesel happening. But the expectation is that by experts is that we will see 1 to 1.2 million barrel of decline in oil demand into 2024. And that will certainly have its impact on oil exporters, both from a growth angle, but also from fiscal and external balances. But I think also the slowdown in China and the EU in particular will have a significant drag on the North African countries, and we have started to see that both in Morocco and in Tunisia, but not only because of these external demand pull factors, and I will speak to that, because of domestic related factors. So that's the first point. Obviously, the global slowdown will start having reverberation, and we are seeing it both in the demand for exports and both oil and non-oil. The second, obviously, one is about the fact that this global slowdown is still being accompanied by economies who are still running too hot, particularly in the US, which at a time where tightening monetary conditions are likely to remain there, at least for the end of the year and well into 2024. We are expecting in Jeffries the cycle of cuts not to start before May of next year. So that will keep basically tight monetary conditions given the inflationary environment. And that in itself will mean higher interest rates, a more difficult borrowing environment. Already many of countries in our regions, from Egypt, Tunisia, of course Lebanon, because it defaulted, have lost access to markets, and that environment of high interest rate, when their debt has become close to unsustainable levels, is going to prevent them from mobilizing the resources that they need for their own growth and development. So that's the second basically factor, the tightening monetary conditions that will continue to drag with us, but which could start basically loosening in the end or the second half of 2024. And depending on the reform path, and that's the third factor that I'm talking about, is that that will impact the outlook, is the fact that we have seen since the beginning of this year a dampened appetite for structural reform. And that has contributed to the slowdown that we have seen in the 2023 compared to 2022, and could continue with us in an environment of slow global growth, but also high interest rates preventing access to capital. So the lack of acceleration of a very full and important structural reform agenda, business environment reform, governance reform, private sector related reforms, public financial management reforms, exchange rate reforms, like in Egypt or Tunisia. These are important policy reforms that we have seen many governments opt for postponing, waiting for the global environment to become a more easy environment, and contributing to further deterioration in the creditworthiness of many of these countries. The fourth element is the global backdrop on the geopolitical front, which has implication obviously because of global supply chain disruption, but also now geopolitical tensions that are threatening the supply of grains and also putting pressures on commodities in the oil market. That in itself will continue to challenge the oil importing countries in particular, and the big consumers of wheat, which in our regions are among the top 10 in the world, namely Egypt and Morocco. And that will be also another factor that will weigh on the decisions of OPEC plus countries and the GCC, obviously, to manage their oil supply priorities, starting by whether we will see a decision by Saudi Arabia to extend the cut even further or change its policies. This geopolitical environment will have a stake. And finally, I would say, in an environment where oil prices and geopolitically has favored oil exporters and have allowed them to accumulate a lot of surpluses, a fifth important driver of regional growth and macro environment have been the policies of the rich oil countries towards regional support and regional lending, and which we have seen fundamental changes in the way they have been acting before. In the past, they were attending to the large financing needs of oil importers when they were under stress. Today, not only do oil exporting countries have different priorities and are pursuing higher rewards and higher rents for their investments abroad at a time in 2022 and 2023 where the economy was adjusting upwards, but they are increasingly linking their aid policies to fundamental reforms within the context of multilateral IMF and World Bank related support, and that has created more strains on flows into the rest of the region. So the risks will flow from this situation that I described. I think we will continue to see a growth slowdown into the end of the year. As I mentioned, we are seeing it in most of the oil importers. The PMI today of Egypt is still below 50, ushering still a contraction. We're in Tunisia and Morocco, even though we have seen improvements on the tourism and services sector related, but we are seeing investments struggling still, particularly in Tunisia. Oil exporters' growth will be affected by the oil OPEC policy and by the prospects of a slowdown in oil demand. So the biggest risk is on the growth path, but also on the nature and quality of that growth, because in many of these countries, the second risk is a risk of debt sustainability. And that is mainly in the oil importers from Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, of course, but Jordan also is being challenged, but also in some debt-challenged oil exporters like Bahrain. Whereas we saw in Oman, the reforms agenda has yielded a significant improvement in that indicator, something that we did not see in Bahrain. So an environment of high borrowing costs will create that sustainability challenges. And finally, the big risk is about the rise in joblessness and social instability when we first have a fiscal constraint in oil importing countries, but also challenges and unwillingness to implement reforms that are necessary to improve growth drivers. In an environment, obviously, where we still have conflict-related that are increasing pressure from refugees, whether in Lebanon or in Jordan or in other countries, and that in itself is creating this rise of joblessness, and limited fiscal space is resulting in those high social and political risks.
Thank you, Alia. This is very, very helpful, and I think it sets the stage for the discussion that we will have shortly. But before we do so, I'd like to go to our dear friend Nasser Saidi, who probably, while listening to you present the outlook for 2023 and 2024 and the risks, is probably putting all of this in maybe a broader historical perspective in the region. After all, this is not the first time that we go through or we face conditions similar to those that most of the countries are dealing with right now: high inflation, a decline in growth, global instability, geopolitical uncertainty. We've been through this before, and I think it would be important to kind of put the current outlook in this historical perspective. I guess the second question to Nasser will hopefully help us with is, a lot of the risks that you presented, Ali, and some of the other international financial institutions spoke about, are all tilted on the downside. meaning things could actually get much worse. The recession could stay, or the slowdown could persist for more than just 2024. And with it, a host of risks that banks, financial institutions, but especially highly indebted countries in the region will have to contend with. And I think with those, Nasser, it would be helpful to get your take on this.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar, Tariq. It's always a pleasure to be with the Middle East Council, particularly when I have good colleagues on the webinar. You're right to ask the question whether this is similar to what we saw in the 70s and 80s. And yes, there are similarities because of higher inflation, high rates. And one thing that is common maybe is the exchange rate regime. When you've got fixed exchange rates, particularly when you're pegged to the US dollar, that means you cannot really run an independent monetary policy. Your monetary policy effectively is tied to the monetary policy of the Fed. And what we're experiencing now is similar to what was happening in the past. You have to follow up with rising interest rates. And the rising interest rates typically mean that if you've got a relatively high debt burden, then the impact can be quite severe, both on your current account and your balance of payments, but also on your fiscal ability to face up to challenges. So if we take some of the countries in the region, we mentioned Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia as some of the highly indebted countries. Egypt is now running around 93% gross debt to GDP, Jordan at 88%, Tunisia at around 80%. For Egypt in particular, interest payments now represent something like 37% of budget expenditures. That is enormous, right? Okay. And with an interest rate environment which is no longer benign, remember that what we've been through in the past 10 years, apart from what happened recently when the Fed started adjusting to higher inflation rates, was a very benign macroeconomic environment with very low, indeed negative real interest rates, low interest rates that encouraged many countries, both publicly and privately, to borrow. So the debt burden accumulated. Now, the point, however, is why did we get here? I think this is what we really need to ask ourselves. And part of the reason has to do with the governance and regulatory frameworks that we have, the burden in many cases of state-owned enterprises and the public sector in terms of the economy. You take a country like Egypt, and more than 60% is public sector. Yeah. Then you've got bloated public sectors across all the countries that we've mentioned. What I mean by bloated public sectors is that much of the employment and indeed continuing employment comes into the public sector. It's not into the private sector. And you have prevented the private sector from really creating the jobs. And to compound the problem, you've got the demographics. You've got young populations across our region, very young populations. And as a result of that, if you look forward and you ask yourself, how am I going to maintain social safety nets? How am I going to provide for public pensions or social security benefits? Then you start getting into the issues of debt sustainability and how do you provide for the future? And then you realize, of course, that our states have played very much the role of mothers. So they provide lots of subsidies. The problem is that much of those subsidies are generalized subsidies, so everybody benefits from that. You need to move towards targeted subsidies, as is happening right now increasingly in Morocco, but not so much in Egypt, Jordan, or other countries. So I mention these because these macro factors and structural factors continue to impinge on your possibility of addressing what are truly the challenges moving ahead. You mentioned the slowdown, and Anya mentioned the slowdown. And yes, we are seeing a slowdown. But I think what's also important, and we need to keep that in mind, is there's also fragmentation of the global economy. The United States right now and Europe are seeking to decouple from China. You had over the past 15 years to 20 years, two engines of growth driving the global economy. One was tremendous growth in China, and in particular, Chinese trade and investment globally, and increasingly China's increasingly playing a role of financing many developing countries and particularly emerging countries. And then you have the United States. Now, having two engines of growth, as we know from aircraft, is extremely good for stability. If you now start talking about decoupling, it's sort of like saying, I'm going to get two engines, each firing on their own and potentially going in different directions. That is destabilizing to the global economy. In the meantime, Europe is facing the Russian-Ukraine war, and it's reverberating across Europe. And Europe has followed Fed policy through the ECB by raising interest rates. And now we're seeing the greatest slowdown is actually happening in Europe, with repercussions on North Africa because of strong trade and investment relations between the North African countries and Europe. So this issue of fragmentation, I think, is an important one for us to handle and discuss how we deal with that. And I have specific views on that, and there may be relatively strong views, and I'll come out with them. So I want to, I'm conscious of time, so I want to focus on a couple of suggestions and areas in which we need to talk. Number one, we need to move towards more flexible exchange rates. A country like Egypt has had overvalued exchange rates. The same is true for Tunisia, the same is true for Jordan. Once you have overvalued exchange rates, you tend to suck in imports and you tax exports, and you don't help the private sector to expand. We need to create the conditions allowing you to move towards more flexible exchange rates and having flexible exchange rates markets. Number two, you need to rethink the size of the public sector. I think that's critical in many of the countries of the region. And it's not necessarily that you want to reduce the size, although that may be necessary, certainly in a country like Lebanon, but you want to think of greater efficiency in the public sector. And what I mean by that, here's a strong focus, is the role of state-owned enterprises and government-related enterprises. If you look at Egypt, the military dominates state-owned enterprises and government-related enterprises. And unlike the earlier period in the 70s and 80s and maybe up to 2010 or so, the private sector was playing a very important role. Since then, much of investment has been undertaken by the public sector and much less efficient than what you had in the private sector. So when you look at fiscal policy and indebtedness, what you need to ask yourself is not just the debt, you also need to look at public sector net worth. There are public assets, and these public assets are substantial. They run from close to 90%, if you look at some of the numbers from the IMF, to 800% in the case of Mongolia, which has a lot of mineral resources. Now, why is this important? This is important because we typically focus, particularly in the debt markets, just on the debt side and say, we discuss debt sustainability. You have to do that, but also look at assets, particularly commercial assets, and how you make those much more efficient. Because if you manage your state-owned enterprises and your commercial assets much more efficiently, that provides you with revenue that you can use. So public sector balance sheets is a critical one. And I just want to end with, because I don't want us to talk about short term. Short term is great, but as we all know, we're dead in the long term if we don't look out for what's hitting us. So I think there are three things that we need to worry about. Number one is climate change. This is the biggest challenge facing the countries of our region because of increased desertification, because of water stress, because of climate-induced migration, and the list goes on. And of course, the fact that most of the rest of the world is going to move towards renewable energy, and we have to move as well, which might have long-term implications for oil prices. Number two is digitalization. What I need to see across the Arab world, I see it in the Gulf, and in the UAE, and Saudi, and a couple of others. I want to see a greater focus on digitalization. The World Bank is suggesting that increased digitalization increases efficiency, e-commerce, you name it, all the services, could increase per capita income by some 40%. I don't know how credible that number is. It's a large number, but even if it's 20%, half of that, it is still a major area we need to focus on. So what I'd like to see is our governments doing, instead of building, bridges to nowhere, as I've seen some in Egypt, I'd like to see them focus on digital infrastructure, enabling the private sector, and helping create jobs for our youth. The third area, and very quickly, has to do with trade. We don't trade with each other. We trade with the rest of the world. We have not focused on economic integration. Despite all the words of the politicians, we don't go for integration. So here's my last point. The world has shifted towards Asia. We continue to have much of our trade agreements and investment agreements with Europe and other colonial powers. That era has ended. So the 70s and 80s and 90s is finished. We're now talking about the 2020s, 2030s and more. And for me, that is Asia and China. So very simply, if we want to create our future for our countries and countries in the region, we need to think of developing trade relations and agreements, deep trade agreements with the Asian countries, starting with China. I rest my case.
Thank you, Nasser. You've made a lot of very important points. We'll come back to you, and I personally want to come back with one or two questions. Something has been absent in a lot of these macro discussions, Alia and Nasser and Ibrahim, in the last 2 years. The focus has been predominantly, and it should be to a large extent, on growth, inflation, debt, financial stability. And that continues to be the case and is likely to be the case for a while to come. But there is a whole development set of issues that are not getting the attention they deserve. And then, quite frankly, the combination of lack of transparency inside of countries, poor data sources, is threatening to allow a lot of vulnerabilities that were there in the region prior to COVID, were made worse during COVID. Think of poverty, think of inequality, think of a host of socioeconomic outcomes that went in the wrong direction in the last decade. There is the threat now of them getting worse over time if they continue to be ignored. And more worryingly, should the predominant focus be on macro stability, what happens to the development agenda? And I think this is where, Ibrahim, perhaps you could help us think through this by taking stock of where we are and what the next year or two, given the slowdown and the monetary tightening, imply for a host of development outcomes we care about. You're on mute, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Tariq. Sorry. I was listening to Alia and Nasser when they talk about the either what would shape the future and the risk associated with this, but I think both agreed on the probably on the agenda of doing some structural reform, which takes us back to this macro picture, and then I will drill down into a recent stuff that we're doing on the middle class and the inclusiveness of the growth and some other variables. As we all know, when inflation hits, it hits normally the lower income groups and the middle class, which I think you were alluded to. But definitely, maybe I can rephrase the question: is that we know that there is a very serious challenge that is facing most of. I wouldn't say, and I agree with the classification either you came up or with Alia, that the resourceful countries like the GCC, countries like Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco are another group, and almost, if not fully failed state, or Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, as we can see. So it's good to keep that in mind, but there is an opportunity for those, the group in the middle at least, at what can be done. And some of the measures that we're talking about, I think it meant, as Dr. Nasser alluded, in Egypt and in other countries. But aware of these challenges, we're not taking the surgical measures in order to address this. Why? This is a question most likely the answer of which lies in politics more than in economics, in terms of the last word you've said, Tariq, stability. Stability, it comes over many other variables, but this stability actually is also, I would say, it's like a moving target. I mean, some of the policymakers in these countries consider that maintaining stability is good to move forward, while even maintaining that stability means that at least you are in the same place where others are moving. So you're already losing in that sense, and that's not sustainable. And that's why fiscal sustainability is very important when we talk about it, given either what is Alia alluded to in terms of access to the capital market, or the fixed exchange rates, or other policies adopted in these countries, which makes the space to maneuver or to move forward is very limited. And here, probably the first point I want to address is that government's response to this pending crisis, as you described it, has been very limited, simply because they want to maintain stability, and also because they don't have any fiscal space to maneuver, nor they can or in a position to improve the efficiency of managing not even the public sector wealth or balance sheet, but even to manage properly the public expenditures in health and education and infrastructure. If you look at all the indicators that is coming out from the World Bank, from the World Economic Forum, it is deteriorating. The quality of the service delivered by this stable government or regimes is deteriorating. So where to go from there, and how you can engage in a very deep structural reform in order to be able, mind you, if they to engage in a deep structural reform, as we put it, like improving the efficiency of the public sector, there will be some political ramifications for such transformation. There will be some serious lashback from the public at large that you are not in a position, or you're not introducing the key word that also has been used, you're not adhering to the best form of governance. So you are now shifting the burden on me as a citizen in this public utilities, in services, in water, in electricity, etc. So this is also the lack of trust between citizens in these countries and the institutions in general. In this respective countries, there is lack of trust, which wouldn't enable even policymakers to communicate this policy to their citizens, or they can engage in a debate to move forward in that. Now, of course, this dynamics is been rigid for some times. I don't know. I mean, the last 10 years, it's since the Arab Spring, and it's this dynamics is expanding the public sector, accumulating debt, but also deteriorating public service. This has its impact on the private sector as well, which is not seeing that the best form of governing. And here, even when I talk about the private sector in our region, I have in mind like different layers of the public, the ones that really productive, innovative, and competitive, and the ones that based on nepotism, wasta, and that form of ineffective or inefficient crony capitalism, as we described, and you are aware of this work by Ishaq on that form of the form of capitalism that's been, and that's quite clear now in countries. It's very stark in Egypt and to that matter. So this is another factor. So anyway, the good private sector, let's say, is also very hesitant to engage in a greenfield or a long-term investment in these respective countries for all kinds of reasons, for weak or bad governance, but also for lack of clear vision or adherence to that vision. Although in theory, most of the countries that we're talking about are adopting visions 2040, whatever. What we're seeing that the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and other countries are really using that vision to sort of set the strategic directions in these countries and trying to get the private and public sector working together towards that. While other countries, Jordan, Egypt, and Tunisia, unfortunately, they're lacking that. Absolutely, they're lacking it, and they're not in a position to sort of attract the private sector to go there. So moving from this situation, the way forward, Tariq, and here I will finish. It's basically we have to go back to the basics. You have to create that enabling environment in terms of infrastructure, business regulations, and more a competitive market. And by the way, on this, just a quick note, it's highly concentrated markets in our region. It's highly concentrated. Few players in each field are controlling more than 80% of the total production. And we've done this analysis on 5 countries: Tunisia, Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, Jordan, and we found that it's a highly concentrated market. So how you can move from there, how you can sort of tangle and deconstruct this quasi-monopolies in order to also move forward in that. Given the public spending, given the the structure, that also total factor productivity, in particular labor productivity, has been really declining in the past 10 years in the region, which also take away any, not only that you have a big exchange rate or monetary policy, but also even you're losing your competitiveness in the labor market in the region. I exclude some of the GCC countries from this generalization because they have been competing on, you know, there is a war, there is a competition on attracting the best talents. They're improving the business environment and the infrastructure. That's something that we must refer to. But in other countries that are really struggling to maintain at least that form of stability, which is it's a fallacy. It's stability just as they describe it, but it's not something that they can sustain in the long run.
Thank you, Brahim. While you've made also some very important points that I will come back to, I've been receiving a lot of questions from the audience and from people who are following us. And I'm going to go back in the same order we started with, and maybe pose a question to Alia. And specifically, the question is as follows. Suppose the current conditions of high interest rates persist for a lot longer than expected, because these are determined, as Nasser reminded us, by what the financial centers across the world do. What are the implications of this for credit, for banking stability, for the vulnerabilities that we all can assume are there within our financial systems across the region? And maybe by way of helping to think through this idea, a lot of people have asked the question, noted the following: despite all the turbulence in financial markets we saw last year and earlier this year, banks in the region seem to get by. There were no banking failures. There were no need on the part of governments to bail out anyone or to provide preemptive funding. Is this due to the banks being really well-run, well-supervised institutions, or are there other indicators we need to be paying attention to as we think about prolonged conditions of tight financial markets and their implications for local economies?
Sure. Sorry, I think certainly the way that we need to think about the implication of a higher interest rate would obviously differ between resource-constrained countries and non-resource constrained countries. Not that the latter will not be affected, but the impact would be mainly through the banking system. Whereas in countries that are already facing large twin deficits, like many of the oil importing countries, the implication is that they will face what I mentioned about the debt distress that we are seeing. I mean, and I think where I sit in the financial markets, the two important countries now that are on top of the radar screen of most financial institutions looking at the region are first Egypt and second Tunisia. Not only because of the high interest rate environment and the fact that those countries have significant debt maturities, external debt maturities due for private creditors in the coming few weeks and months, but also because private creditors today are not clear about the extent of commitment of both these countries to the structural reform agenda that, at least on policy, they said they are committed to with the IMF. I mean, in Tunisia's case, obviously, we've seen the president completely, basically, push back against what he called the diktats of the IMF at a time where it is as obvious that the reform program was a national reform program presented by the Tunisian government, and it was not at all imposed by the IMF, but rather really the IMF has learned its lessons from previous programs in Tunisia and tried to accommodate them. But obviously the political and the political economy context that Brahim has referred to is making the domestic conditions becoming even harder than what the credit markets are imposing on those countries in terms of pricing of risk, at least in the case of Tunisia. In the case of Egypt, I think the political environment related to the uncertainty about election, as Dr. Nasser, the fact that there's a pushback against the flexible exchange rates and the fact that the process by which the government has been implementing state ownership or the divestments of assets away from the public sector has not yet given the confidence to the private sector to step in. So you are in a way not getting the private investment through your policy of public sector divestment, but also you have credit constraint in terms of private sector lending you from abroad. And that is creating a lot of problems of financing the economy on the one hand, and big question mark on the commitments to the IMF program. And that is putting a lot of pressure on credit markets and the creditworthiness of Egypt at a time, obviously, where social concerns are. So the higher interest rate is adding to this very difficult domestic environment of pushback against reform, lack of clarity on commitments to the IMF, and feeding into worsening of pricing of credit risk. Now, on the higher interest rates on the banking side, and particularly in the GCC, obviously are going to weigh onto the profitability of the banks. But we all know that these are banks in the GCC that are well capitalized, that have strong backstop from the sovereign. But what we are seeing is that we are starting to see a slowdown in credit to the private sector in many of these economies, particularly in Saudi, a little bit in Qatar and the UAE, mainly because a large part of the portfolio of the banking sector's assets are tilted toward mortgage kind of financing that is weighing on the capacity of both, particularly of citizens to repay the loans in an environment of high interest rates. So that is going to create a problem in terms of the asset quality, maybe in some jurisdictions. And this is why I think the role of fiscal policies in an environment of tight and high interest rate becomes even more important in the GCC in order to dampen the contractionary impact of higher interest rates on the supply of credit to the private sector. And that is possible because today in the Gulf, most of the governments have relatively very strong balance sheets, and they are running either surpluses or close to balance. They have significant reserves, and that will dampen the impact of the high interest rates on the oil exporting countries that we are seeing hit very hard the economy and citizens in through the credit channel at the sovereign level in the oil importing countries.
Thank you, Alia. Nasser, I think you've provoked me at least when you, on the one hand, talked about the ongoing fragmentation of the international system. And yet you made a strong pitch for regional integration through trade and other forms of integration, being one of the vehicles that could help promote just not only growth, but productivity and dynamism within the region. One of the questions that came from the audience pertains to the question of BRICS. We now have countries in the region, important countries, large countries that have joined the BRICS group. They appear to be making bigger commitments and orienting themselves to being either integrated elsewhere in the world, outside of the region, or being a part of conversations on platforms such as BRICS and others on how to diversify partnerships and how to diversify the sources of trade and growth. How do you, on the one hand, reconcile this ongoing fragmentation, which our countries are also participating in, with the need or the call for regional integration within the Middle East, right, being something that is on the agenda?
I think that is straightforward. To me, global fragmentation is an opportunity for us to integrate more closely because there's this global de-integration happening. What do I mean by that? I like the idea of regional globalization, which is coming out from the Gulf countries. What I mean by that is that if we look at our main trade partners today, they are the Gulf countries for many of the countries of the region, yeah, increasingly as well for North Africa. And the Gulf countries are integrated into global supply chains. The other countries, despite the Barcelona process, despite the Euromed agreements and all the rest, the North African countries have not really gotten integrated into global supply chains. Egypt is not. So my pitch is the following. Given the enormous resources that the Gulf countries have, and given a new orientation by the Gulf countries and their sovereign wealth funds to invest at the level of the region, and given that the Gulf countries, Saudi, UAE, are now joining BRICS and will become increasingly integrated into BRICS, and I take the UAE, it's developed a whole series of comprehensive economic partnership agreements, CEPAs, with a large number of countries, including with India and all the rest. This is a great opportunity for our countries to increase their trade relations and investment relations with the Gulf countries. So I would go for having CEPAs between the Gulf countries and the rest of the Arab region, at least those who are willing to do so, which would then mean that those countries become integrated into global supply chains through the GCC. So that is much more integration via the GCC and opening up to the rest of the world. That's the idea. And I think I now see a political will in the GCC countries to do so, which was not the case in the past. Also true, because we discussed this a bit earlier, is that they will not come and rescue you if you don't want to undertake reforms. I think Brahim was alluding to that, Alia maybe as well. But I think there's an important message here, that in the past, many of the countries that fell into problems used to say, well, it's okay, I can always rely on the Gulf countries to come in and rescue me. That is no longer, I believe, on the table. The Gulf countries have their own strategies, their own visions. They feel much more empowered as middle countries, if you want to take that term. They don't feel that they belong much in the West. Their main trade partner is now China, and it is Asia. So if I'm looking at where the markets are for me, for my exports, they are in Asia. And increasingly, if we integrate in our region itself. So the message is, get your house in order and come to me. I'm willing to integrate. I'm willing to provide you with finance. I'm willing to provide support, but you need to be willing to reform. So the idea that you just come knocking on the door and I will help you is no longer on the cards. However, the opportunity, because of this global fragmentation, is that I am willing to integrate you into my economies. Already, if you look at Arab youth is coming to the Gulf countries. You ask Arab youth, where do you want to work? Where do you want to start a business? Where do you want to get employed? And they'll all tell you, I want to come to the Gulf. I want to come to the UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, and all the rest. There is a reason for that. The reason is that they're providing a conducive environment, which you're not finding elsewhere. They've undertaken reforms. They were willing to innovate. They've got help they're willing to provide to SMEs and to innovation and entrepreneurship. I don't hear that message elsewhere. So youth is coming here. So I'd like to build on that. That's the idea I was trying to promote. I was trying to pitch.
Thank you, Nasser. Very clear. Ibrahim, you started already unpacking this whole business about the promise of the private sector, but you ran out of time. I'd like you to speak a bit more about this, if only because, 20 years ago, when many of us were younger and maybe more hopeful, the private sector was seen as the answer to much of the region's development problems back then. Growth problems, lack of total factor productivity growth, lack of dynamism. You asked the question, which actor in the economy should be supported, should be given the opportunity, should have the obstacles removed, and a host of regulatory changes be effected to support them. It was the private sector. And yet, the very international financial institutions now that would say this 20 years ago, did say this with a lot of confidence, are now sort of walking back from that. They're not as enthusiastic, at least. It's not clear what we mean now by the private sector, given the track record. Now, you've alluded to what you said, where maybe a private sector we should be, in fact, trying to reform, and a private sector that we should be empowering and supporting. Can you, for the sake of thinking also about the future and thinking about what Nasser suggested is the way to go, you integrate, you fix your house, and then you integrate through the dynamic pockets of the regional economy. And quite frankly, also Alia has used the term structural reform, and I assume that also has embedded in it an assumption about the role of the private sector, right?
Thank you. And I totally agree. And it's like fixing your own house. Definitely, you need to do a lot of things. But we have also to consider, where we're talking about either introducing structural reforms or reforming the private sector, we have to think about the capacity to reform. This is something that the state capacity also to introduce these forms, not only the desire to do it, but also the capacity to do it. One example that Dr. Nasser in his introductory remark talked about digitization, for example, and how much it would add in terms of value. But then the next question is, do the states as we know it today have that capacity? Most likely the answer, they have limited capacity. And second, the same processes that you need to digitize, and I remember I shared with you an article, it simply cannot be done, Tariq. It's simply you need to revisit the whole process in order to be able to really move it and utilize the technology and use the digitization, which politically means that there is a good governance and all equal when you are sitting in front of the computer, which will take a lot of rent from those who are running the bureaucracy as well. So the resistance to reform actually would definitely come from those who are preferring to maintain the status quo because they're quite happy, they got jobs, and they're also exploiting whatever discretionary power they have in that sense. And this is very important. And then to do that reform, administrative reform, as we describe it, at least in Jordan, you really need then the political will and leadership to really advance in this. Similarly, the private sector. Now, I sort of added that classification for the private sector because I see also their capacity in order to be more competitive and to integrate more. As Dr. Nasser said, it's also they're somehow quite comfortable. This is the comfort zone that they're operating in. Getting in and out of the market is quite difficult. You've asked earlier about the banks. And, you know, even during COVID and after COVID, at least in Jordan, they registered the highest ever profits in the case of Jordan. So access to finance, they're very well protected. There's a limited number of banks operating. You're part of, anyway, you know more probably about the banking system, but yet they managed to register the highest profit at the time when the economy was slowing down. Literally, it was negative growth rate at that time. So that's something. Now, we can talk a lot. Actually, we're talking about the private sector and the PPP and the PP law. Again, I want to allude to the Jordanian experience. Over the past 2 years, we amended the PPP law 3 times in Jordan. And how many projects we managed to execute under the law? None. None, because the way sometimes you structure or introduce the reform and the way they execute it, and then to really for that to materialize, it's not an easy process, and therefore we sweet talks about this partnership, but we see little of that happening, and now each country has its own dynamics in the sense of which part of the private sector I want them to partner with the government in terms of execution, and how much I can evacuate and open the space for the private sector to sort of come into the game. So it's I think it's truly a partnership. It genuinely has to. It takes a lot of efforts in order to translate and getting the private sector in the big area in education, in health, and even in terms of infrastructure. But so far, there has been some success stories in Morocco, probably in Tunisia, slightly in Egypt. However, we have not built on that. And there is always that, like we're moving 1 step forward, but sometimes we go back 2 steps and not creating that dynamism or the level of trust. We change the rules of the game in the middle of the game in many cases, in many instances, which would not encourage private sector to engage in long term. There is the already established one who are in the market, and that's it for them. They will keep working no matter what are the conditions. And there is the new private sector, new dynamics that we're trying to get into the market, which so far I don't think we're successful. At the same time, the rhetoric is that the only driver of growth is the private sector. The only driver, the only agency that would create jobs is the private sector. But do we match this with, in terms of policies and openness and inclusiveness? I'm not sure that is happening. And that's actually the only way I see for countries that have some fiscal constraints in the region, how we can move forward and how you can better integrate. Because this regional integration, I think all of us have done a lot of analysis about it, but it's even at the time when the GCC countries are expanding and et cetera, so far we're not making the best out of that. And for that, you really need an engagement, not only of the governments or the officials who would, with their nice announcement, but also the real engagement with the private sector and what they can do.
Thank you, Ibrahim. You know, Alia, we've focused many of our examples on Tunisia and Egypt, partly because they are in the news and their IMF programs have been something that investors and markets have paid attention to. But it's other countries that are now in some sort of an IMF program. One is surprised actually by the number of countries in the region. I mean, they would include Jordan, they include Morocco, they include Mauritania. If not for the political dysfunction, Lebanon would probably be in an IMF program. Syria would be in an IMF program. Yemen would be in an IMF program. Are markets paying attention to the other countries in the region? Do they matter here or do they not? And are their problems just way too specific to them? I ask this question because one of the issues one of the themes in our discussion today, and I'll direct another question to Nasser about this, is, can we still talk about one Middle East that the world is looking at, or are there multiple Middle East? And this fragmentation that is underway reflects a much broader trend in how analysts and markets and look at it. Alia?
No, absolutely. I think there is no one Middle East, and I also I realize even among Middle Easterners that many of us colleagues, our friends from the Gulf, try to push back against being always be considered as part of the Middle East economic meltdown, when their economies basically are thriving and really sort of their aspirations of being part of the G20 world are taking them in a completely different direction. No, I'm sure Dr. Saidi will talk more about this, but certainly from a market perspective, the approach to the Middle East is one of credit differentiation and stories that are mainly driven by global factors. I mean, in the case of the GCC, it's really whatever is happening in the oil market and the reform agenda of many of these countries and the supply of the issuance that is happening. And we have seen since the beginning of the year, the Gulf countries really and the IG or investment grade type of credit or close to it, like Morocco and Oman, being the darlings of markets because they have good stories to tell, good macro adjustment, good reform agendas that are coupled with rather favorable conditions globally. And then you have the other pile of distressed credits that where a combination of tough global conditions with high interest rate, as we saw, the reticence and the slow pace of structural reform, and the fact that the narrative coming out of these countries is not appealing enough. And that narrative sometimes, unfortunately, comes from policymakers who themselves are also tired of getting beaten by the market in an environment that they find very, very difficult to attend. But for Yemen, Syria, the conflict countries, unfortunately, their only attention that market gives to them only comes through their implication and the spillover onto the other countries. Like if the Yemen war re-erupts and causes more risk for the Gulf countries, then that becomes an important for them. Similarly for Syria and the issue of the refugee and how it's weighing on the macro of Lebanon and Jordan. So from that perspective, they follow, but really the attention is on these two core group of countries that are becoming increasingly 2 worlds apart.
Thank you, Alia. Nasser, I'm getting some pushback on your story about regional globalization. One of the comments received is as follows. Each of the Gulf countries that has formed a relationship with China or has joined the BRICS is doing it for its own interests. And it's not thinking about collective GCC, let alone collective regional integration into the new fragmenting global economy. We're also, as some would note, witnessing for the first time open competition between the Gulf countries in this very region itself. And so how would you respond in terms of what is needed to kind of overcome potentially some of the resistance or some of the bias in how global integration in the future can bring together greater regional integration?
Sure. Let's remember, before many of us were born, there was something called the Arab Common Market that was supposed to be developed, and the Arab League, right? It was signed in 1953 in Rome, if my memory serves me right. Okay. The truth is, we have not built Arab institutions. We have not built Arab institutions. They do not play a role, unlike what we've seen maybe in Europe, despite any misgivings one can have. And so the Gulf countries as well look at this landscape. They finance past efforts by countries or efforts at reform, but those efforts at reform have not delivered. So for many of them, they're saying, how do I develop? How do I focus on my own economic and financial development? And I cannot tell them don't. I can only say, go ahead and do so. However, where I think there is a difference is that when they turn towards BRICS, I think the underlying strategy behind that is that I need a different vehicle apart from what I've had in the past, be it G20 or something else. And I'm not saying that BRICS is going to be solving all problems. It will not. This is a long-term, medium to long-term effort to start developing a different vision and view of the world. What I would say, however, is that increasingly, if I look at trade patterns, if I look at investment patterns, increasingly, whether there are agreements or there are not agreements, the rest of the Arab world is becoming more integrated on the trade side and investment side with the GCC. I don't include in that the distressed countries or failed states or countries that have lived through violence and war. But if I look at all the others, including Jordan, including even Lebanon, Egypt, and all the rest, increasingly they're developing trade relations with the GCC. So I think what we as social scientists and as potential advisors to policymakers need to do is to say, let's produce some policy vehicles that can help integrate those countries. So let me give 2 examples. One is trade logistics and infrastructure. If you look at the Gulf countries, the infrastructure that they have, ports, airports, logistics, transport, and all the rest, are much bigger than their own domestic requirements. So they can integrate you into their airports, ports, and transport and logistics. That is one avenue. If you do that, and you start integrating through those logistics and transport and infrastructure, then automatically you get integrated into global supply chains. That's one example. The other is on digital and on energy. I don't want to be futuristic, but if I look at the map, increasingly we're going to be going towards solar and renewable energy. Our countries and the GCC and North Africa have a comparative advantage in solar. So I can easily see a map in the future where we can be supplying green, renewable energy, solar-based energy to both Europe and to most of the Middle East. That requires integration of power infrastructure. It also requires integration of digital broadband. What prevents that? What prevents that is that in many of the countries, you have monopolies in telecoms. Remove those monopolies in telecoms, integrate your broadband infrastructure, and then you can provide many digital services from where you are. So if I just look at those examples, and there's nothing that prevents it, really. Brahim was talking about stability. The problem is that the private sector in many countries says, hey, I want stability, meaning I don't want competition. So please don't let anybody come in. I'm happy making the profits that I want. That is the stability they talk about. Instead, I'd like to hear much more about what are you going to do about innovation? What are you doing about digitalization? If the governments cannot do so, then please remove the state-owned enterprises from that. Let the private sector do it. Don't impose rules and regulations on the private sector. Let them come in and do it. If I look at Morocco, for example, 20 years back, they started opening up the telecom sector, and they're continuing to open up. So there are a couple of very good stories across the region whereby if you open up these sectors, then a lot of the barriers start falling out. So in answer to your question, two things. Integrate infrastructure. Yeah. That will open up trade. It'll facilitate trade and allow you to be integrated with the rest of the world. Move next towards having deep trade agreements. Put that on the policy agenda. Go to your ministers of economy and finance and tell them, hey, I heard that the UAE is starting negotiation with New Zealand on a CEPA. How about if we could have one with the UAE and Saudi? Those are the sort of things. But then I don't really hear the private sector in many of the countries in our region, in Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, and others. I don't hear them saying that. All I hear them saying, hey, if you're going to open up, please be careful. I want to protect this little industry that I have, this little workshop that I have. There is no vision for the future. And so I think it's a challenge also to the private sector.
Brahim, I'm going to give you the last 2 minutes we have, and no more than 2 minutes to respond to what Nasser said, because there is a piece there about the private sector. There is a piece about renewables. There's climate change was already mentioned earlier.
Integrating the infrastructure. And I want to give two examples that I have personally sort of lived and survived. One is that we wanted to provide, in Jordan, we want to provide Lebanon with electricity, which we were having some excess electricity, and we want to send that to Lebanon. Of course, that has to go through Syria, and the World Bank provided a guarantee. I don't know if Alia knows the details. So we were really into that project with all the political parties sort of aligned, including the Syrian government. But now we haven't done the project. That was not the case. Again, with Iraq, they have power cut. We could provide them with electricity. Then who is going to finance the infrastructure and how you can maintain and sustain? So practically, what is Dr. Nasser is saying is music to our ears. And also we have a project in the pipeline that would connect Iraq to Jordan to Egypt, etc. These are the kind of real infrastructure projects, at least in one sector, which is the energy, which is feasible, profitable, and something that can be done. But practically, for sometimes political, sometimes capacity, and sometimes lack of funding modality, etc., you're hitting the wall. So sometimes also examples on this, unfortunately, do not lead themselves to imagine that even there will be some integration and communication in a security-driven apparatus that would be even extremely difficult.
You see,
Thank you, Brahim.
Brahim, they
for
listen to you.
responding.
They listen to you and they say, "I want stability. Please don't let me get these other guys." Right?
Yes. Nasser, Brahim, and Alia, thank you so very much for spending the past hour and 15 minutes with us. I have learned a great deal from all of you. I'm sure the audience feels the same way. We'll continue the conversation. We'll be picking up many of the ideas you've outlined today and working on them together. I already know I'm traveling with Ibrahim to China and working with Nasser on Korea, South Korea, and the Gulf, and with Ali, of course, the conversation is always continuing because we need to know what our market's thinking and saying and doing about our economies. Really, thank you so very much for being with us today. Look forward to seeing you again, inshallah, in the near future. Good luck with all that you have to do. And ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very pleasant day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you on behalf of all of us.